My name is Walter Hensley, and at 78 years old, I thought I'd earned the right to some peace. For 43 years, I served as principal at Maple Falls High School here in Oregon, watching generations of kids grow into decent adults. These days, my mornings start with black coffee on the wraparound porch of the craftsman home Margaret and I built back in '72, looking out over our 14 acres of apple trees that stretch down toward Miller's Creek. The orchard wasn't much when we bought this land, just scraggly trees and Oregon blackberry vines choking everything decent. But Margaret had vision, God rest her soul. She'd stand in that same spot where I take my coffee now, pointing toward the creek and saying, "Walt, someday those trees will feed half of Yamhill County." She wasn't wrong. Our Gravenstains and Honeycrisps supply Murphy's Market downtown, plus 3 farm stands between here and McMinnville. People in town know me as steady, I suppose, fair but firm, same way I ran the school. Every Thursday night, you'll find me at the Veterans Hall on Elm Street, playing 5-card stud with Earl Jameson, who taught shop class for 30 years, and Doc Peterson, our retired town physician. Sundays I sing bass in the choir at First Methodist, though my voice isn't what it was when Margaret used to harmonize beside me in the alto section. The house is worth close to $2 million now, according to the real estate assessor. Add in the orchard income and my retirement savings. Well, let's just say Margaret and I lived simply but invested wisely. We always believed in taking care of family, putting money away for Claire's education, making sure she never wanted for anything. After Margaret passed 4 years ago, that nest egg grew to around $420,000 in our joint savings account. My grandson Eli visits every Sunday after church. He's 13 now, all elbows and enthusiasm, with his mother's dark hair but his grandfather's hands, already skilled with tools despite his age. Out in the old equipment shed, I've been teaching him proper carpentry the way my father taught me. Last month, we rebuilt the workbench from scratch, using Douglas fir planks I'd been seasoning for 2 years. Eli has patience, unusual for his generation, the kind that comes from understanding that good work takes time. "Grandpa?" he asked last Sunday, carefully measuring twice before making his cut like I'd taught him. "Why don't Mom and Troy ever come see the orchard projects?" I told him some people prefer finished things to the making of them, but the question stuck with me. Claire used to love this place when she was his age, climbing trees and helping Margaret preserve apples every September. Now my daughter visits maybe twice a month, always with that pinched look around her eyes that started after her divorce 3 years back. She works part-time at the county assessor's office downtown, never quite settled into anything solid after teaching didn't work out. During our visits, she'll mention financial stress in that careful way people use when they're hoping for an offer of help, but won't ask directly. Being her father and knowing how pride runs in our family, I usually slip her a check for a few hundred before she leaves. What Claire doesn't know is that I keep detailed records of everything, a habit from my principal days when school board audits meant having every receipt and expenditure documented. In the bottom drawer of my desk, I maintain ledgers showing property taxes, orchard income, household expenses, and investment returns. My former student Mark Hanley, who went on to become one of McMinnville's most respected lawyers, handles my legal affairs and manages a separate investment account that brings in steady returns. Mark stops by monthly to review paperwork and share coffee, usually bringing news about his own grandchildren or updates on legal matters affecting local property owners. The evening routine rarely varies. After dinner, I read the Yamhill Valley News Register on the front porch, watching the sun set behind the Coast Range. The orchard settles into dusk quiet, just the sound of wind through apple leaves, and the distant hum of traffic on Highway 18. It's a good life, the kind Margaret and I planned for these years, simple, productive, surrounded by the work of our hands and the community we helped build. But last Tuesday, everything changed. I was cleaning up the dinner dishes, thinking about whether to spray for aphids this week, when the phone rang. Claire's voice came through the receiver tight, with something I couldn't quite identify. Fear, maybe, or excitement masquerading as worry. "Dad, I need to come over," she said, not bothering with her usual pleasantries about the weather or asking after my health. "It's urgent. Troy and I will be there within the hour. The line went dead before I could ask what kind of urgent business couldn't wait until Sunday's regular visit. Standing in my kitchen, listening to the dial tone, I felt the first whisper of unease settle in my chest like morning fog rolling up from the valley. Troy Patterson stood 6'2" in my doorway that Tuesday evening, all confident handshake and expensive cologne, wearing a charcoal suit that probably cost more than most folks in Maple Falls make in a month. Claire had mentioned him before, her new boyfriend from Portland who worked in business development, but this was our first meeting. His smile showed too many teeth, the practice kind I'd seen on school board politicians trying to sell budget cuts as improvements. Mr. Hensley. It's an honor, he said, gripping my hand longer than necessary. Claire's told me so much about this beautiful property. You've built something really special here. His eyes weren't looking at me while he spoke. They were cataloging everything visible from the front door. The antique oak furniture, Margaret's collection of Depression-era glassware, the framed photographs of 4 decades of graduating classes lining the hallway walls. Claire looked different than she had during Sunday's visit just 5 days prior. Her auburn hair was styled in a way that suggested a salon visit, and she wore a dress I'd never seen, navy blue with small pearl buttons that caught the porch light. But underneath the new polish, her eyes held the same anxious energy I'd noticed in struggling students who knew they were failing but couldn't admit it to their parents. Dad, we wanted to talk to you about helping with some things around the house, she began, settling into Margaret's favorite armchair like she was claiming territory. Troy and I have been discussing how hard it must be for you to manage everything alone. The orchard work, paying all these bills, keeping up with maintenance on a property this size. She gestured toward the stack of mail I'd left on the side table, mostly agricultural supply catalogs, and the monthly statements I always reviewed on Wednesday mornings. Troy picked up the conversation without missing a beat. Sir, what Claire's trying to say is that we'd like to help shoulder some of these responsibilities. I have experience managing business operations, streamlining expenses, that sort of thing. Maybe I could take a look at your monthly costs, see where we might find some efficiencies. His tone was smooth, professional, like he was proposing a business merger rather than meddling in an old man's finances. Over the following weeks, they established a routine that felt helpful at first, but gradually became intrusive. Troy would arrive Thursday mornings, ostensibly to assist with errands, driving me to Murphy's Market for groceries, accompanying me to the bank when I made my weekly deposit of orchard income, sitting in on my monthly coffee meetings with Mark Hanley, where we discussed property taxes and investment returns. He had opinions about everything: my choice of fertilizer supplier, the efficiency of my irrigation system, even the wisdom of maintaining separate checking and savings accounts, rather than consolidating everything for better management. The guest bedroom above the kitchen became Troy's unofficial office. Claire explained that he was launching a new business venture and needed quiet space to work, away from the distractions of Portland city life. Most evenings I could hear him on conference calls that stretched past midnight, his voice carrying through the old house's thin walls as he discussed market penetration strategies and investor relations in the kind of corporate jargon that always made my teeth itch. My neighbors started noticing changes too. Betty Kowalski, who'd lived next door for 26 years, mentioned seeing Troy walking the property boundaries with a measuring tape and clipboard, taking notes about something. Earl Jameson asked during Thursday night poker why that city fellow was parked in my driveway at all hours, using my internet to run what looked like some kind of online business. Even Pastor Williams at First Methodist pulled me aside after choir practice to ask if everything was all right, having heard from parishioners that strangers were making inquiries about local property values and development potential. The first piece of equipment disappeared on a Wednesday. I went to the shed looking for the hydraulic jack I used for orchard maintenance, and found an empty spot where it normally sat beside my tool bench. When I asked Claire about it that evening, she explained that Troy had sold it through some online marketplace. Apparently I'd mentioned needing cash for property taxes, and they were just trying to help by liquidating unused assets. The jack was worth maybe $200, hardly enough to matter, but something about the casual way she dismissed my confusion bothered me more than the missing equipment itself. By October, Troy had positioned himself as the helpful son-in-law I'd never had. He charmed the ladies at Murphy's Market, discussing local business prospects with the kind of enthusiasm that made people feel important. He bought drinks for the regulars at Sal's Tavern downtown, listening to their complaints about property taxes and development pressures with the sympathetic attention of a practiced salesman. To hear him tell it, he was practically family. Just a successful businessman who'd fallen in love with small-town Oregon and wanted to contribute to the community. But late at night, when the house settled into its familiar creaks and sighs, I'd lie awake thinking about the small changes that didn't quite add up. Tools relocated in the shed, mail arriving for Troy at my address, phone calls that ended abruptly when I walked into the kitchen. Most troubling were the documents I'd seen scattered across the guest room desk, contracts and agreements with letterheads I didn't recognize, financial projections that seemed to involve my property address. The wake-up call came on a gray November morning when I checked my mailbox and found a notification from First National Bank of McMinnville. The envelope was addressed to me, but the account summary inside showed a joint checking account I shared with Claire for emergency purposes, an account that should have held about $8,000 in case she ever needed immediate access to funds for Eli's care or her own emergencies. Instead, the balance showed $150,000 had been withdrawn in a single electronic transfer 3 days prior. The authorization signature was Claire's, which gave her legal access, but the amount represented more than a third of my total savings money that had taken Margaret and me decades to accumulate through careful living and wise investing. Standing in my kitchen with that bank statement in my trembling hands, I finally understood that the storm hadn't just moved in. It was already tearing my life apart from the inside. The confrontation happened in my kitchen on a Sunday afternoon that should have been peaceful. Claire arrived alone for our usual visit, but instead of the casual conversation we'd shared for years, she came prepared with explanations that sounded rehearsed. She'd poured herself coffee from the pot I always kept ready, and settled at the table where Margaret used to pay household bills, her posture defensive before I'd even asked the question. "Dad, I know you're wondering about the bank account," she began, not meeting my eyes. "Troy's business opportunity required immediate capital investment, and since we're family, I knew you'd want to help. This could change everything for us. For all of us, really. He's projected returns of 30% within 6 months, which means you'd get back nearly $200,000 on that $150 we borrowed." Borrowed. She used that word like it softened the reality of taking money without permission. Money that represented years of Margaret's careful budgeting and my summer work painting houses to supplement our teaching income. I'd taught high school students for 4 decades, and I recognized the signs of someone who'd convinced themselves that wrong was right through sheer repetition of justifications. "Claire, that money was for emergencies," I said, keeping my voice level the way I'd learned to do when dealing with difficult parents who thought their children's failures were everyone's fault but their own. "Your mother and I saved every dollar of it by doing without things we wanted so we'd have security in our old age. You can't just decide it's available for investment schemes without even asking." Her response cut deeper than the theft itself. "Dad, you're 78 years old. What are you saving for? You've got this huge property, more money than you could spend in your remaining years. And meanwhile, I'm struggling to keep Eli in decent clothes and pay rent on a 2-bedroom apartment that's falling apart. Troy's showing me how to think bigger than just hoarding money in some savings account that barely earns interest." The stress of it started affecting my health within days. I'd wake at 3 in the morning with chest pains that felt like someone was sitting on my rib cage, a tightness that made breathing difficult. Doc Peterson ran tests at the clinic downtown and found elevated blood pressure, irregular heartbeat, all the classic signs of an old man's body responding to sustained worry. He prescribed medication and rest. But how do you rest when your own daughter is systematically dismantling the life you spent decades building? Meanwhile, Troy's success became increasingly visible around town. The luxury SUV parked in my driveway was a black Escalade with dealer plates from a Portland dealership, the kind of vehicle that costs more than most local families' annual income. He'd taken to wearing expensive watches and tailored clothing, presenting himself as a successful entrepreneur who'd discovered the untapped potential of rural Oregon communities. At Sal's Tavern, he bought rounds for everyone, talking about development opportunities and investment strategies with the confidence of someone spending other people's money. Eli noticed the changes too, though he processed them with the quiet observation skills that reminded me of myself at his age. During our Sunday carpentry sessions, he'd grown quieter, less eager to share stories about school or friends. Finally, while we were sanding wood for a new storage cabinet, he looked up from his work with troubled eyes. "Grandpa, I heard Mom and Troy talking about you yesterday," he said, his young voice heavy with adult concerns. "Troy said you were old-fashioned and didn't understand modern business. Mom laughed and said something about people who can't adapt getting left behind. They didn't know I was listening, but it made me mad. You're the smartest person I know." That conversation revealed more than Eli realized. Later, when I asked him to help me organize some papers in the house, he mentioned that he'd been taking screenshots on his phone whenever he overheard Troy's business calls. "I don't trust him, Grandpa," he whispered, showing me text messages he'd captured where Troy discussed flipping the orchard land and maximizing development potential with someone named Marcus who apparently had connections with Portland area real estate developers. The evidence painted a picture that made my blood run cold. Troy wasn't just taking my money, he was planning to take my land. The text messages Eli had documented included references to moving the old man into assisted living and clearing title for subdivision development. My 14 acres of prime agricultural land with creek frontage and development potential would be worth millions to the right buyer, especially if the current owner was no longer around to object to zoning changes. By December, my remaining savings account showed $270,000, still substantial, but representing the complete financial security Margaret and I had built over 50 years of marriage. Every time I drove past First National Bank of McMinnville on my way to Murphy's Market, or the post office, I thought about that money sitting there vulnerable to someone with Claire's legal access and Troy's persuasive influence over her decisions. The breaking point came on a Wednesday evening when I returned from choir practice to find both Claire and Troy waiting in my living room. They'd let themselves in using the spare key I'd given Claire years ago for emergencies, and they'd been going through the papers on my desk: bank statements, property tax records, insurance policies, all the private financial documents that represented my personal business. "Dad, we need to talk about your future," Claire announced, with the kind of forced cheerfulness that made my skin crawl. "Troy's found a lovely assisted living facility in McMinnville, Sunset Manor. They have openings, and honestly, it would be so much safer for you than rattling around in this big house alone. Think about what would happen if you fell, or had another one of those chest pain episodes. Who would find you?" Troy nodded supportively, his expression appropriately concerned. "Sir, the facility has 24-hour medical staff, social activities, meals prepared by professional kitchen staff. You'd have companionship with people your own age, and Claire and I could manage the property maintenance and business operations without you having to worry about any of it." Standing in my own living room, looking at these two people who were calmly disposing of me like an inconvenient responsibility, I felt something shift inside my chest. Not the physical pain that had been plaguing me for weeks, but something harder and colder. In 43 years of education, I dealt with bullies, thieves, and manipulators of every description. The mistake they'd made was assuming that age had made me weak instead of wise. That night, after they'd left with promises to research options and make arrangements, I sat in the equipment shed where Eli and I had spent so many peaceful hours building things that would last. Margaret's father had built this shed in 1954, using hand tools and lumber that was meant to endure. In the bottom drawer of his old workbench, wrapped in oilcloth that still smelled of linseed, I found what I was looking for: the original property deeds, a key to a safe deposit box I'd nearly forgotten about, and a bank book showing an account Margaret had opened in 1987 that had been earning compound interest for 35 years. The next morning, I made a phone call I should have made weeks earlier. "Mark," I said, when my former student answered his office phone, "this is Walter Hensley. I need to see you today, and I need you to bring everything we've discussed about estate planning and property protection. It's time." The announcement came over breakfast on a Friday morning in mid-December. delivered with the casual confidence of people who believed they held all the cards. Claire had arrived early, bringing fresh donuts from Krispy Kreme in McMinnville, a gesture that might have seemed thoughtful if I hadn't learned to recognize her guilt-driven generosity. Troy followed 20 minutes later, carrying a manila folder thick with brochures and documents, his expression appropriately somber for what they clearly considered a difficult but necessary conversation. "Dad, we've made some decisions that we think are best for everyone," Claire began, arranging the donuts on Margaret's good china plates like she was hosting a social gathering. "Troy's been researching senior living options, and we've found the perfect place. Sunset Manor has an immediate opening, and they're willing to hold it for 72 hours while we arrange the transition." Troy spread the brochures across my kitchen table with practiced efficiency, pointing out amenities like he was selling a vacation package. "Mr. Hensley, this facility offers everything: medical staff, social programs, transportation services. The monthly cost is $3,800, which is actually quite reasonable considering the level of care. We've already spoken with the administrator, and she's excited to meet you." The presumption was breathtaking. They'd researched facilities, spoken with administrators, made financial commitments, all without consulting the person whose life they were rearranging. When I asked about the timeline, Claire's answer revealed the real urgency behind their concern for my welfare. "We're thinking next weekend would be perfect," she said, not quite meeting my eyes. "That gives us time to pack your personal items and arrange for the transition. Troy's already spoken with a property management company about handling the orchard operations and house maintenance while we sort out the long-term arrangements." Long-term arrangements. The phrase hung in the air like smoke from a house fire, carrying implications they weren't quite ready to state directly. But I'd been an educator long enough to read between the lines of careful language. They wanted me out of the house so they could control the property, the income, and whatever remained of my financial assets. The physical changes to my home had accelerated over the past 2 weeks. Troy had converted Margaret's sewing room into what he called a business center, complete with multiple computer monitors, filing cabinets, and equipment I didn't recognize. The guest bedroom now looked like a corporate office, with whiteboards covered in financial projections and property development timelines that made my stomach turn when I glimpsed them through the half-open door. Most insulting was the casual way they'd begun treating my possessions as their own. Margaret's jewelry box had been moved from our bedroom dresser to Claire's purse for safekeeping. Family photographs had been taken down from hallway walls to reduce clutter during the transition. Even my father's tools in the equipment shed had been inventoried and appraised, supposedly to streamline the estate for easier management. Eli had become collateral damage in their planning. When he arrived for our usual Sunday carpentry session, Claire informed him that visits would be suspended until after the holidays. "Grandpa's going to be adjusting to his new living situation," she explained with false sympathy, "and it's better if we don't disrupt his routine with too many visitors." The boy's face crumpled, but he nodded with the resignation of a child who'd learned that adult decisions weren't subject to negotiation. That afternoon, after they'd left with promises to return Monday with final arrangements, I sat alone in the equipment shed that had become my refuge. The space felt different now, smaller somehow, like walls were closing in around the life Margaret and I had built together. 53 years in this house, 43 years serving the Maple Falls community, decades of careful saving and responsible living, all of it reduced to an inconvenience that needed managing by people who viewed my existence as an obstacle to their ambitions. I pulled out my father's toolbox, the heavy oak case he'd carried to construction jobs throughout the 1940s and 50s. Inside, beneath the vintage hand tools that still held their edge after 70 years, I found the items I'd hidden there weeks earlier: bank documents, property deeds, and the key to a safe deposit box that contained financial resources Claire and Troy had never discovered. Margaret and I had learned caution during the Depression years, when banks failed and people lost everything they'd trusted to institutions. Some assets, we'd decided, should remain completely private until they were needed. The safe deposit box at Oregon Community Bank contained certificates of deposit worth $310,000, purchased over the years with orchard income that I'd never reported to Claire during her casual inquiries about my financial status. Margaret had insisted on maintaining these completely separate accounts, joking that even married couples should have mad money that nobody else knew about. Her wisdom had seemed paranoid at the time, but now it represented the difference between helplessness and having options. More importantly, the box contained updated property deeds that I'd had Mark Hanley prepare 2 years earlier. After Margaret's death made me realize how vulnerable a single elderly person could become. The 14 acres, the house, even the equipment shed where I now sat, all of it was protected by legal structures that Claire and Troy had never suspected. Their casual confidence in controlling my assets was about to encounter some expensive surprises. But the real revelation came from Eli's screenshots, which I'd been studying with the careful attention I'd once devoted to evaluating troubled students. Troy's text messages revealed connections to Portland developers, county planning officials, and real estate attorneys who specialized in family property transitions. This wasn't opportunistic theft. It was organized exploitation of elderly property owners, probably part of a pattern that had worked before on other families in similar situations. That evening, I called Mark Hanley at his home number, something I'd never done in 20 years of professional relationship. "Mark, this is Walter Hensley," I said when he answered. "I need to see you first thing Monday morning. And I need you to bring everything, the trust documents, the power of attorney revisions, all of it. I'm ready to implement the protections we discussed." His response told me he'd been expecting this call. "Mr. Hensley, I've been hoping you'd reach out. I've heard some concerning rumors around town about your daughter's boyfriend, and I've taken the liberty of doing some preliminary research. I think you're going to want to see what I've found." Sunday night, I stood at my bedroom window looking out over the orchard that had been my life's work, watching moonlight catch the bare branches of apple trees that would bloom again in spring if I could protect them from the people who saw only development potential in soil that had fed my family for half a century. Tomorrow, the real fight would begin. Tonight, for the first time in months, I felt like the educator who'd spent 4 decades outmaneuvering people who thought they were smarter than the old man with the patient smile and the long memory. In the morning, I would stop being the victim of this story and start being its author. Claire and Troy had made the mistake that destroys most criminals. They'd assumed their target was helpless. They were about to learn that there's a significant difference between being old and being defenseless, and that some lessons are expensive enough to last a lifetime. Mark Hanley's law office occupied the second floor of a restored Victorian house on 3rd Street in McMinnville, the kind of solid, unpretentious space where serious business gets conducted without flash or ceremony. On Monday morning, I climbed those familiar stairs carrying a briefcase full of documents and a clarity of purpose I hadn't felt since retiring from education. Mark greeted me with the respectful concern of someone who'd been my student 30 years ago and had never forgotten the lessons about preparation and strategic thinking. "Mr. Hensley, I'm glad you called," he said, settling behind a desk covered with legal folders that bore my name. "I've been researching your daughter's boyfriend, and what I've found is deeply troubling. Troy Patterson has a history. 3 states, multiple identities, and a pattern of targeting elderly property owners through family relationships. He's not just a con man, he's a professional predator with serious legal exposure." The research Mark had compiled painted a picture that made my stomach turn. Troy Patterson was actually Troy Peterson, with outstanding warrants in Nevada and California for elder fraud, identity theft, and forgery. His business opportunities had bankrupted at least 6 families across the western states, always following the same pattern: infiltrate through a romantic relationship, gain access to financial information, isolate the target from outside support, then systematically drain assets while positioning for property seizure. "The good news," Mark continued, spreading documents across his desk, "is that we've been preparing for exactly this scenario since your wife passed. The trust structure we established protects your property from any claims or debts associated with family members. As of this morning, your 14 acres are legally owned by the Walter and Margaret Hensley Family Trust, with you as primary trustee and Eli as secondary beneficiary. The property transfer had been accomplished through paperwork prepared months earlier, but never activated until now. With my signature on a few key documents, The house and orchard became untouchable by anyone seeking to claim family connection or financial authority over my assets. Even if Claire had been granted power of attorney, which she hadn't, the trust structure would have protected the real estate from any decisions made on my behalf. More satisfying was the revision to my will that Mark had prepared based on our previous discussions about family responsibility and consequences. Claire's inheritance was now limited to $1 and a sealed letter explaining why her choices had eliminated her from benefiting from her parents' life work. The bulk of my estate would establish an educational scholarship fund administered by the school district, with Eli receiving full ownership of the orchard when he reached 25. But legal protection was only the beginning of what Mark had planned. Mr. Hensley, based on what you've told me and the evidence your grandson has collected, I believe we have grounds for both civil and criminal action. Troy Patterson has committed multiple felonies, and your daughter may be legally liable as an accomplice if she knowingly participated in defrauding you. The next phase required careful coordination and absolute secrecy. Over the following 2 weeks, while Claire and Troy continued planning my involuntary relocation to Sunset Manor, I worked with Mark to document every aspect of their scheme. Eli became our crucial ally, using his access to the house and his invisibility as a child to photograph documents, record conversations, and gather evidence that would be admissible in court. The boy took to the work with intensity that reminded me of his best students, kids who understood that some fights matter more than others. He'd arrive for our suspended carpentry sessions through the back entrance to the equipment shed, carrying a backpack full of printed screenshots, recorded audio files, and detailed notes about conversations he'd overheard between his mother and Troy. "Grandpa, they're planning something for next weekend," he reported during one of our clandestine meetings. "Troy has been talking to someone named Marcus about finalizing the property acquisition and eliminating obstacles to development. I don't think they're just trying to put you in a nursing home. I think they want to take everything." The evidence Eli gathered revealed the full scope of their intentions. Troy had been negotiating with Portland developers to subdivide the orchard for residential construction, potentially worth over $3 million in development profits. The plan required removing me from the property, gaining legal control over the land through Claire's family connection, then pushing through zoning changes that would allow high-density housing construction along Miller's Creek. Meanwhile, I used my contacts throughout Yamhill County to gather intelligence about Troy's activities. Earl Jameson, who'd taught shop class for 30 years and knew every contractor in the region, reported that Troy had been meeting with surveyors and civil engineers, commissioning studies for subdivision development. Betty Kowalski mentioned seeing strangers with clipboards measuring my property boundaries and taking soil samples near the creek. Most damaging was information provided by Pastor Williams at First Methodist, whose congregation included several county employees. According to church members who worked in the planning department, Troy had submitted preliminary applications for zoning variances and development permits, using forged documents that claimed he held power of attorney over my financial and property decisions. By the second week of January, Mark had assembled a comprehensive legal case that included fraud, forgery, elder abuse, and conspiracy charges. But rather than moving immediately, we decided to let Troy and Claire proceed with their plans until they committed acts that would be impossible to explain as misunderstandings or good intentions gone wrong. "Mr. Hensley, they're going to incriminate themselves more thoroughly if we give them rope," Mark explained during one of our strategy sessions. "Right now, Troy could claim he was legitimately trying to help with your care, and Claire could argue she was acting in your best interests. But if they follow through with forcing you into assisted living and taking control of your property, that becomes kidnapping and theft, federal crimes with serious prison time." The waiting was the hardest part. Every day I watched Claire and Troy move through my house like they already owned it, discussing renovation plans and property improvements with the casual confidence of people who believed victory was inevitable. Troy had begun receiving mail at my address from real estate attorneys, development consultants, and construction contractors eager to begin work on what they understood to be his new acquisition. But beneath their confidence, I noticed signs of growing desperation. Troy's phone calls had become more frequent and more urgent, suggesting that his financial backers were expecting results on a specific timeline. Claire seemed increasingly anxious, jumping at unexpected sounds and checking her phone obsessively for messages that made her face go pale when she read them. On Thursday evening, as I sat in the equipment shed reviewing the evidence we'd compiled, Eli arrived through our usual back entrance, carrying news that made my blood run cold. "Grandpa," I heard Troy talking to Marcus about accelerating the timeline. "He said something about not being able to wait for you to agree to move. They're planning something for this weekend," and Mom seemed really scared when he told her about it. That night, I called Mark with a simple message. "It's time to spring the trap." Within hours, wheels were in motion that Troy Patterson had never seen coming, set by people who understood that some crimes deserve consequences that last a lifetime. The student was about to receive an education in the difference between cunning and wisdom, delivered by teachers who'd been practicing patience and preparation since before he was born. The first blow landed on a gray Tuesday morning in late January, when Mark Hanley filed a comprehensive civil lawsuit in Yamhill County Circuit Court. The 47-page complaint detailed fraud, elder abuse, forgery, and conspiracy charges against Troy Patterson, with Claire named as a co-defendant for her knowing participation in the scheme. By noon, process servers had delivered copies to both defendants, along with temporary restraining orders that immediately froze their access to any accounts containing my money. I was in Murphy's Market buying coffee when Claire called, her voice shaking with what sounded like genuine panic for the first time since this nightmare began. "Dad, what have you done? There are lawyers at the house, and Troy's talking about police and criminal charges. Why didn't you just talk to us if you had concerns? We were trying to help you." The shift from confident manipulation to victim playing was swift but not unexpected. I'd seen the same transformation in students who'd been caught cheating on exams, sudden claims of misunderstanding, desperate attempts to reframe deliberate deception as good intentions gone wrong. But after months of watching them systematically loot my life savings and plot to steal my property, I felt no sympathy for their predicament. "Claire, I did talk to you," I said calmly, standing between the canned goods and produce section, while other customers pretended not to listen. "I asked about my missing money, and you called it borrowing. I questioned your boyfriend's business activities, and you told me I was too old-fashioned to understand. Now you're learning that some misunderstandings have legal consequences." Within hours of the civil filing, Mark had coordinated with the Yamhill County Sheriff's Office to execute search warrants on Troy's devices and business records. The investigation had been building quietly for weeks, with law enforcement agencies in 3 states sharing information about Troy's previous victims and ongoing criminal activities. What they found in his laptop and phone records provided enough evidence to support federal charges that would put him in prison for decades. Detective Sarah Chen, who specialized in financial crimes against elderly victims, called me Wednesday afternoon to discuss the criminal case. "Mr. Hensley, your documentation and your grandson's evidence have given us the strongest elder fraud case I've seen in 15 years. We're talking about organized conspiracy, multiple counts of wire fraud, identity theft, and forgery. This isn't someone who made bad decisions. This is a career criminal who's been running the scam across multiple states." The evidence revealed connections to a broader network of people who specialized in targeting elderly property owners throughout rural Oregon and Washington. Troy's phone contained contact information for real estate attorneys who facilitated fraudulent property transfers, county officials who expedited zoning changes for development projects, and other con artists who provided references and credibility for long-term infiltration schemes. Most damaging were recorded conversations between Troy and his associates, discussing strategies for removing obstacles to property acquisition. While they'd been careful not to explicitly threaten violence, the implications were clear enough to support charges of conspiracy and intimidation of elderly victims, federal crimes that carried mandatory minimum sentences under laws specifically designed to protect vulnerable populations. The media attention began Friday when Jennifer Walsh from the Yamhill Valley News-Register called requesting an interview about alleged elder fraud involving prominent local property owners. Word had leaked through court filings and police reports, creating exactly the kind of public scrutiny that people like Troy typically avoided by targeting isolated victims who were too ashamed or frightened to seek help. Mr. Hensley, we'd like to tell your story as a warning to other families in similar situations. Jennifer explained during our phone conversation. Elder fraud is increasing throughout rural Oregon, and most victims don't have the resources or knowledge to fight back effectively. Your case could help prevent other families from experiencing similar victimization. I agreed to the interview partly for community education, but mostly because I wanted Troy Patterson's face and criminal history published where his future potential victims might recognize him. The article ran Sunday morning with the headline, "Local Retiree Fights Back Against Elaborate Elder Fraud Scheme," accompanied by photographs of both Troy and Claire that would make it difficult for them to continue operating in Yamhill County or surrounding communities. The town's reaction was swift and decisive. By Sunday afternoon, I'd received calls from dozens of community members offering support, sharing their own experiences with suspicious characters, asking questions about property values and family circumstances, and providing additional information about Troy's activities that I forwarded directly to Detective Chen's investigation. Earl Jameson called to report that Troy had approached him months earlier about purchasing equipment from my orchard, claiming he had authorization to sell assets on my behalf. Betty Kowalski remembered seeing Troy with surveyors near Miller's Creek, taking measurements and soil samples without permission. Even Pastor Williams had concerning information about Troy's conversations with elderly parishioners regarding their estate planning and family financial situations. But the most satisfying call came from Mark Hanley Tuesday morning, his voice carrying the kind of excitement that meant significant legal developments. "Mr. Hensley, we just received word that the FBI has arrested Troy Patterson on federal charges. They picked him up at a Portland hotel where he'd been staying since the restraining orders were served. Apparently, he was planning to leave the state, but federal agents had been monitoring his movements since our criminal complaint was filed." The arrest took place during Maple Falls' annual Winter Festival, a community celebration that draws visitors from throughout Yamhill County. Troy Patterson was led away in handcuffs from the Red Lion Hotel in Portland, while families in my hometown were enjoying ice skating, hot chocolate, and the kind of small-town festivities that represent everything good about rural Oregon communities. Claire's reaction to Troy's arrest revealed the extent of her involvement in the scheme. Rather than expressing shock or demanding explanations, she immediately hired a criminal defense attorney and began negotiating with prosecutors about cooperation agreements and plea bargains. Her quick pivot to self-preservation suggested she'd understood the criminal nature of their activities all along and had been hoping to escape consequences through family connection and claims of manipulation. That evening, as I sat in the equipment shed where this fight had really begun, Eli arrived carrying a printed copy of the News Register article about Troy's arrest. The boy's face showed a mixture of satisfaction and sadness that I recognized from my own complicated feelings about watching my daughter face criminal charges for betraying everything our family had represented. "Grandpa, does this mean it's over?" he asked, settling on to the wooden stool where he'd learned carpentry skills that would serve him throughout his life. "Will Mom go to jail? Will everything go back to normal?" I looked at this 13-year-old boy who'd shown more loyalty and courage than his own mother, who'd risked family conflict to protect his grandfather's life work, and I realized that normal had changed forever. The innocence of trusting family members completely was gone, replaced by hard-earned wisdom about human nature and the price of naivety, in a world where some people view elderly relatives as resources to be exploited rather than treasures to be protected. "Eli," I said, reaching for the words that would help him understand both justice and forgiveness, "it's not over yet, but we're winning. And whatever happens to your mother, you'll always have a home here. And you'll always have family who puts your welfare above everything else. That's what real family does." The asset forfeiture hearing took place on a Wednesday morning in early March, with Judge Patricia Morrison presiding over proceedings that would determine the fate of everything Troy Patterson had purchased with my stolen money. The black Escalade sat in the courthouse parking lot, soon to be seized along with expensive watches, electronics, and other luxury items he'd acquired during his months of living off my life savings. Mark Hanley presented a detailed accounting of every fraudulent transaction, supported by bank records, receipts, and digital evidence that Detective Chen's investigation had uncovered. The luxury SUV alone was worth $68,000. Purchased with a cashier's check drawn from the joint account Troy had convinced Claire to drain without my knowledge or permission. His shopping sprees at Portland boutiques, high-end restaurants, and electronics stores created a paper trail that would have impressed any auditor. Judge Morrison's questions were sharp and focused, revealing her familiarity with elder fraud cases and her impatience with defendants who targeted vulnerable populations. "Patterson," she said during his brief court appearance, "the evidence suggests systematic exploitation of an elderly victim over several months. This wasn't impulsive poor judgment. This was calculated criminal behavior designed to separate a 78-year-old man from assets he'd accumulated through 50 years of honest work." Troy's court-appointed attorney offered weak arguments about misunderstandings and good intentions, but the digital evidence was overwhelming. Phone records showed coordination with known associates in similar schemes. Bank transactions revealed patterns identical to his previous victims in Nevada and California. Most damaging were the text messages Eli had captured, discussing property development plans and strategies for removing obstacles to complete control of my assets. Claire's legal situation proved more complicated but equally devastating to her future prospects. Her cooperation with prosecutors had earned her a plea agreement that avoided federal charges, but civil liability remained substantial. Mark's lawsuit sought full restitution plus punitive damages, potentially leaving her financially responsible for losses that exceeded her ability to pay for the rest of her working life. "Miss Hensley," Judge Morrison addressed my daughter during her plea hearing, "you held a position of trust as Mr. Hensley's daughter and joint account holder. That trust was exploited to facilitate crimes against your own father, crimes that could have left him destitute and homeless in his final years. The court considers family exploitation of elderly relatives to be among the most serious breaches of social responsibility." The financial recovery exceeded even Mark's optimistic projections. Asset forfeiture returned nearly $400,000 in cash, vehicles, and luxury goods. Criminal restitution orders added another $250,000 in future payments from Troy's associates who'd profited from the scheme. Insurance claims against Troy's business bonds provided additional compensation for victims across multiple states, creating a recovery fund that restored most of what had been stolen from my accounts. But money was only part of the justice I'd sought. The criminal convictions would follow Troy Patterson for the rest of his life, making it nearly impossible for him to repeat these crimes against other elderly victims. His associates faced similar charges in federal court, dismantling a network that had operated across the western states for several years. Most satisfying was knowing that future potential victims would be protected from experiencing the betrayal and fear that had consumed months of my life. Claire's punishment was more personal, and, in some ways, more severe than legal consequences. The publicity surrounding the case had made her unemployable in Yamhill County, where her reputation for elder abuse would follow her indefinitely. Friends and community members who'd respected our family for decades now viewed her with suspicion and disgust. Even casual encounters at Murphy's Market or the post office resulted in cold shoulders and whispered conversations. More painful was her loss of relationship with Eli, who'd moved in with me permanently after Child Services investigated his living situation during the criminal proceedings. The boy had testified in family court about witnessing his mother's participation in planning my financial exploitation, describing conversations where she'd mocked my concerns and dismissed my rights as obstacles to their success. No 13-year-old should have to choose between parents and grandparents, but Claire had forced that choice through her own actions. The house felt different after reclaiming complete control of my property and finances. Spaces that Troy had occupied were cleaned and reclaimed, but the memory of his presence lingered like smoke from a house fire. Margaret's sewing room required complete renovation to remove the equipment and odor of his business operations. The guest bedroom needed new furniture to replace items that had been seized as evidence or forfeited as proceeds of criminal activity. Most importantly, I'd implemented security measures that would prevent future exploitation. Mark had structured new financial accounts with multiple authorization requirements, making it impossible for any single person to access substantial amounts without independent verification. The property trust was reinforced with additional legal protections, ensuring that Eli's inheritance would be protected from any claims or debts associated with his mother's choices. Community support during the legal proceedings had been overwhelming and deeply moving. Church members provided meals and companionship during court appearances. Former students, now adults with families of their own, stopped by to offer assistance with orchard maintenance and household tasks. The poker group at the Veterans Hall had taken up a collection to help with legal expenses, though Mark's contingency fee arrangement meant their generosity wasn't necessary for financial reasons. Earl Jameson summed up the community sentiment during one of our Thursday night card games. "Walt, what happened to you could have happened to any of us. These predators look for decent people who trust family and want to help their children succeed. You fighting back and winning sends a message that our community protects its own, especially when outside criminals think they can exploit our values against us." By late spring, the legal proceedings had concluded with outcomes that exceeded my expectations for justice and restitution. Troy Patterson was serving a federal prison sentence that would keep him incarcerated until he was too old to effectively victimize anyone else. His associates faced similar consequences, and law enforcement agencies had used our case to identify and protect other potential victims throughout the region. Claire had moved to Portland, where her connection to the Maple Falls elder fraud case was less well known and employment opportunities remained possible. She'd signed away all parental rights to Eli as part of her plea agreement, understanding that her relationship with him had been permanently damaged by her choices. The boy received occasional cards and letters that he read without comment, filing them in a drawer where he kept reminders of painful lessons about trust and family loyalty. On the anniversary of Troy Patterson's first appearance at my front door, I stood in the orchard watching Eli practice the carpentry skills we'd resumed in the rebuilt equipment shed. The trees were heavy with developing fruit, promising another successful harvest season. The financial recovery had funded improvements to irrigation systems and storage facilities, ensuring that the orchard would remain productive and profitable for decades to come. That evening, as we cleaned up wood shavings from another successful project, Eli looked up from organizing tools with the careful attention I'd taught him from the beginning. "Grandpa," he said quietly, "I'm proud of you for fighting back. A lot of people would have just given up and let them win." His words carried weight beyond his 13 years, reflecting hard-won understanding about courage, justice, and the responsibility to protect what matters most in life. The civil trial began on a Monday morning in late April, with spring sunshine streaming through the tall windows of Yamhill County Courthouse, while attorneys arranged exhibits that would determine the final financial reckoning for months of systematic exploitation. I sat in the front row behind Mark Hanley, wearing the navy blue suit I'd reserved for graduations and funerals, prepared to testify about the most painful betrayal of my 78 years on Earth. Claire's defense attorney, a sharp-dressed woman from Portland named Rebecca Martinez, had built her strategy around portraying my daughter as another victim, a struggling single mother manipulated by a sophisticated con artist who'd exploited her financial desperation and romantic vulnerability. During opening statements, Martinez painted Troy Patterson as a master manipulator who targeted Claire specifically because of her access to my assets and her emotional need for stability after her divorce. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Martinez said, gesturing toward Claire with practiced sympathy, "my client is not a criminal. She's a woman who fell in love with someone who seemed to offer security and partnership, someone who convinced her that helping her elderly father with financial management was an act of caring rather than exploitation. Claire Hensley was deceived just as completely as her father, and punishing her further serves no purpose of justice." Mark's response cut through the emotional manipulation with laser precision, presenting evidence that Claire had known exactly what she was doing and had actively participated in planning my financial destruction. Bank records showed her accessing my accounts multiple times without authorization, always in amounts carefully calculated to avoid triggering automatic fraud alerts. Phone records revealed conversations with Troy about my daily routines, security habits, and the location of important financial documents. Most damaging were the recordings Eli had captured, played for the jury through speakers that filled the courtroom with Claire's voice, discussing my old-fashioned stubbornness, and Troy's assurances that the old man won't be around forever to complain. Her laughter during these conversations destroyed any pretense of innocence or manipulation, revealing someone who'd actively participated in planning her own father's victimization. When called to testify, I walked to the witness stand with the same steady composure I'd maintained during 43 years of dealing with difficult parents, hostile school board meetings, and budget crises that threatened programs I'd spent decades building. The courtroom was packed with community members, former students, and media representatives who'd followed the case since Troy's arrest made headlines throughout Yamhill County. "Mr. Hensley," Mark began, "please tell the jury about your relationship with your daughter before Troy Patterson entered your lives." His questions led me through decades of supporting Claire's education, helping with her divorce expenses, providing regular financial assistance, and maintaining the kind of close family relationship that had made her betrayal particularly devastating. I trusted Claire completely. I testified, looking directly at the jury rather than toward the defense table where my daughter sat, avoiding eye contact. When Margaret died, Claire was the person I turned to for emotional support and practical help. She had keys to my house, access to my financial information, knowledge about my daily routines and security habits. That trust made me vulnerable to exactly the kind of exploitation that occurred. The defense cross-examination attempted to portray me as a controlling patriarch who'd failed to understand his daughter's financial struggles or appreciate Troy's genuine efforts to help with property management. Martinez suggested that my age had made me paranoid about normal business activities, unable to distinguish between legitimate assistance and criminal exploitation. "Mr. Hensley," she asked with careful sympathy, "isn't it true that you were suspicious of Troy Patterson from the beginning, simply because he was dating your daughter and represented change in your established routines?" Her tone suggested that elderly prejudice rather than legitimate concern had motivated my resistance to their help. The question gave me an opportunity I'd been hoping for. "Martinez, I was suspicious of Troy Patterson because he immediately began asking detailed questions about my financial assets, property values, and estate planning. Questions that had nothing to do with dating my daughter and everything to do with evaluating my worth as a potential victim. In 43 years of education, I learned to recognize predatory behavior regardless of how it's disguised. Eli's testimony proved to be the turning point that destroyed any remaining sympathy for Claire's claims of victimization. The boy took the witness stand with quiet dignity, answering questions in clear, factual language that carried more impact than any adult's emotional appeals. He described conversations he'd overheard, text messages he'd documented, and his growing understanding that his mother and Troy were planning something that would hurt his grandfather. "Did you ever hear your mother express concern about Mr. Patterson's treatment of your grandfather?" Mark asked during direct examination. Eli's answer was delivered without hesitation or emotion, simply stating facts as he'd observed them over months of careful attention. "No, sir. Mom always agreed with Troy about Grandpa being stubborn or old-fashioned when he didn't want to do what they suggested. She laughed when Troy called him senile or talked about moving him to a nursing home. She never seemed worried about Grandpa's feelings or whether what they were doing was right." The defense's cross-examination of Eli backfired spectacularly when Martinez attempted to suggest that a 13-year-old boy couldn't accurately understand adult conversations or business relationships. Eli's responses demonstrated intelligence and observational skills that impressed the jury while highlighting the courage required for a child to testify against his own mother in order to protect his grandfather. "Mrs. Martinez," Eli said when she questioned his ability to comprehend financial fraud, "I understood that taking someone's money without permission is stealing, and I understood that lying about business opportunities to get that money makes it worse. Those aren't complicated ideas that require special adult knowledge." The surprise witness that sealed Claire's fate was Margaret Sullivan, wife of Yamhill County Circuit Judge Robert Sullivan, who'd been victimized by Troy Patterson 3 years earlier in a nearly identical scheme. Her testimony established pattern evidence that destroyed any claims of good intentions or misunderstanding, revealing Troy's systematic approach to targeting elderly property owners through family connections. Mr. Patterson used the same techniques with my late husband that the evidence shows he used against Mr. Hensley, Margaret testified, her voice steady, despite the obvious pain of recounting her family's experience. The romantic involvement with a family member, the gradual assumption of financial responsibilities, the isolation from outside advisors, even the specific language about helping with modern business practices and streamlining outdated financial management. This wasn't improvised exploitation. This was a carefully planned criminal enterprise. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning a verdict that awarded full restitution plus punitive damages totaling $1.2 million. Judge Morrison's comments during sentencing reflected both legal precedent and community standards regarding family exploitation of elderly relatives. Miss Hensley, the judge said, looking directly at Claire for the first time during proceedings, you violated the most sacred trust that exists in civilized society, the obligation of adult children to protect rather than exploit their elderly parents. This court finds that your actions were knowing, deliberate, and motivated by greed rather than any concern for your father's welfare. The financial penalties imposed today reflect society's condemnation of elder abuse and serve as deterrent to others who might consider similar crimes. As the courtroom emptied and reporters hurried to file stories about the verdict, I remained seated for several minutes, processing the end of a legal battle that had consumed nearly a year of my life. Justice had been served, financial losses had been recovered, and criminal penalties had been imposed. But the deeper damage, the destruction of family trust, and the loss of innocence about human nature would never be fully repaired. Eli waited beside me as the courthouse cleared, his small hand resting on my arm in a gesture of comfort that reminded me why this fight had been necessary. Whatever Claire had lost through her choices, whatever pain this legal victory had caused our family, protecting this boy's future and preserving the values Margaret and I had tried to instill made every difficult moment worthwhile. Some battles must be fought regardless of their cost, and some victories matter more than the price paid to achieve them. The settlement check arrived on a Thursday morning in early June, delivered by registered mail that required my signature and carried the weight of complete financial vindication. $850,000 in restitution and punitive damages, plus the return of all seized assets, had restored not just my financial security, but my faith in the legal system's ability to protect elderly citizens from predatory family members and sophisticated con artists. I stood in my kitchen holding that check, remembering the morning 8 months earlier when I'd discovered my savings account had been emptied, and my daughter had laughed off my concerns about her boyfriend's suspicious business activities. The numbers on this bank draft represented more than monetary compensation. They symbolized society's recognition that what had been done to me was criminal, unacceptable, and deserving of consequences that would deter future similar crimes. Rather than simply depositing the settlement into personal accounts, I'd worked with Mark Hanley to develop investment strategies that would benefit the broader community while ensuring Eli's educational future. Half the money went into diversified portfolios that would fund his college expenses and provide startup capital for whatever career path he chose. The remainder would establish the Margaret Hensley Memorial Scholarship Fund, helping local students attend college who might otherwise lack financial resources. The orchard had never been more productive or profitable than during this season of renewal and restoration. With settlement funds, I'd invested in modern irrigation systems, improved cold storage facilities, and equipment that reduced the physical demands of fruit production while increasing yield quality. Earl Jameson's grandson Jake had joined our operation as summer manager, bringing agricultural science knowledge from Oregon State University that complemented my decades of practical experience. Most satisfying was hiring local teenagers for seasonal work, providing employment opportunities that taught work ethic, responsibility, and pride in agricultural production. These kids reminded me of students I'd mentored during my education career, eager to learn, willing to work hard when properly supervised, capable of more than adults often expected from their generation. Eli had matured considerably during our legal battle, developing judgment and character that impressed every adult who worked with him. His carpentry skills had advanced to the point where he could complete complex projects independently, and his understanding of orchard operations made him a valuable partner in planning improvements and expansions. More importantly, he'd learned lessons about loyalty, courage, and standing up for what's right that would serve him throughout his life. "Grandpa," he said one evening, as we reviewed plans for a new equipment shed, "I want to create a scholarship specifically for kids whose families have been hurt by financial crimes. Not just poor kids, but kids whose parents made bad choices or got tricked by criminals. They shouldn't be punished for things they couldn't control." His suggestion became the foundation for a program that would help children of incarcerated parents, victims of family financial fraud, and young people whose educational opportunities had been damaged by adult crimes or poor decisions. The Eli Hensley Second Chance Scholarship Fund would be administered through the school district, providing not just tuition assistance but mentoring support from community volunteers. The town's recognition came during Maple Falls' annual Apple Festival in September, when Mayor Janet Richardson presented me with a Lifetime Achievement Award for community service and resilience in the face of adversity. Standing on the bandstand in downtown Riverside Park, surrounded by families who'd supported me throughout the legal battle, I felt the kind of satisfaction that comes from knowing you've fought the good fight and emerged victorious. "Walter Hensley represents the best of our community values," Mayor Richardson announced to the festival crowd. When faced with betrayal and exploitation, he didn't retreat into bitterness or despair. Instead, he fought back with intelligence, determination, and legal resources that protected not just himself, but future potential victims throughout our region. His courage has made all of us safer. The festival's celebration included a display of photographs documenting the orchard's history from Margaret's initial planting through current expansion projects. Visitors could walk through rows of mature apple trees while learning about sustainable agriculture practices, family business succession planning, and the economic importance of small farms to rural Oregon communities. Most moving was the unexpected appearance of former students who'd driven from Portland, Salem, and other cities to attend the festival and express their gratitude for lessons that had influenced their adult lives. Teachers rarely get to see the long-term impact of their work, but that afternoon provided glimpses of successful careers, strong families, and community leadership that trace back to principles learned in Maple Falls High School classrooms. Jennifer Walsh from the News Register interviewed me for a follow-up article about recovery and renewal after elder fraud victimization. "Mr. Hensley," she asked, "what advice would you give to other elderly residents who might be targeted by similar schemes?" Her question prompted reflection about lessons learned from an experience I wouldn't wish on anyone, but that had ultimately strengthened both my character and my community connections. "Trust your instincts," I replied, thinking about the early warning signs I'd ignored because I wanted to believe family loyalty would protect me from betrayal. If something feels wrong, investigate before it becomes a crisis. Maintain relationships with people outside your family who can provide objective advice when you're too emotionally involved to see clearly. And remember that asking for help is a sign of wisdom, not weakness. The anonymous donations to other fraud victims had been among the most satisfying uses of settlement money. Detective Chen had provided information about elderly residents throughout the region who'd been victimized by Troy's associates, but lacked resources to recover their losses. Cashier's checks sent without identification had helped restore retirement savings, pay medical expenses, and maintain independence for people who'd suffered similar betrayals. By November, the financial and legal aftermath of Claire and Troy's crimes had been completely resolved. Property ownership was secure, investment accounts were protected by multiple authorization requirements, and estate planning documents ensured that Eli's inheritance would be preserved regardless of future family complications. More importantly, the community awareness generated by media coverage had educated other potential victims about warning signs and protective strategies. Claire had made no contact since the trial ended, though Eli occasionally received birthday cards postmarked from various Pacific Northwest cities where she'd apparently been seeking employment under her maiden name. The boy read these cards without comment, filing them in a drawer with other reminders of relationships that had been permanently damaged by adult choices. Neither of us could understand or forgive. As autumn settled over the orchard and this year's harvest exceeded all previous records for both quantity and quality, I reflected on unexpected blessings that had emerged from the worst experience of my adult life. The legal victory had been satisfying, but more important were the strengthened community relationships, the deepened bond with Eli, and the knowledge that our fight had protected other families from similar victimization. Standing in the equipment shed where this battle had really begun, surrounded by tools that represented 4 generations of family craftsmanship, I understood that some victories matter more than others. Margaret would have been proud of how we'd defended everything she'd helped build, and she would have loved seeing Eli develop into the kind of young man who understood that family means protecting each other rather than exploiting vulnerabilities for personal gain. The evening light filtering through apple trees, heavy with fruit, reminded me that seasons of hardship eventually give way to seasons of abundance, and that the sweetest harvests often come after the most challenging growing periods. Tomorrow would bring new projects, new challenges, and new opportunities to apply lessons learned during the hardest year of my life. Tonight, surrounded by evidence of renewal and restoration, I felt ready for whatever came next. On Christmas morning, 18 months after Troy Patterson first darkened my doorway, I sat at the kitchen table where Margaret used to wrap presents for grandchildren she'd never lived to see grow up, writing a letter that would serve as both legacy and instruction manual for the young man who'd become the most important person in my world. Eli was still sleeping upstairs in what had once been Claire's childhood bedroom, now permanently his home and sanctuary.